Hello and welcome to this lesson on using annotation-based configuration with Spring. In the previous lesson, we saw how to configure beans using Java configuration feature. We had created a separate class, annotated it with @configuration, and defined beans in it using bean definition factory methods annotated with @bean. There's another way to do configuration in Spring. Instead of having to create a separate configuration class on the bean classes themselves, you can apply some special annotations, and these special annotations tell Spring that these classes are beans and what kind of beans. So Spring can automatically detect and register them as bean definitions. So the most general annotation to define a class as a Spring bean is an annotation called @component. So @component is called a generic stereotype annotation for specifying that a class is a Spring bean. This @component can be applied on any class, and for that class you don't need to have a separate bean definition method in a Java configuration or a bean definition tag in XML configuration or anything like that. Just applying the annotation on the class is sufficient. This @component annotation has many specializations. So the most notable ones are @repository, @service, and @controller. These three specializations are meant to be applied on the beans coming from the three principal layers of an application. @repository annotation is meant to be used on classes coming from the data access layer, that is the DAO objects or the repository objects. Applying this @repository tells both the developer and the Spring framework that this is a data access object. And Spring even actually provides some special facilities for classes annotated with @repository. On the other hand, @service is an annotation applied on beans which come from the business logic layer or the service layer. This basically conveys to the developer that this bean plays the role of a service layer. And @controller annotation and its specialization known as @rest controller is used in web-based applications where we have something known as controller classes in the web layer. So any class annotated with @controller, @rest controller, etc. will automatically be recognized as controller classes by Spring. And controller classes are classes which have the ability to intercept incoming HTTP requests. We'll see that in future. So these annotations can be applied on any class, and you don't need to have explicit configuration methods for them. You actually don't even need to have explicit configuration class if all your beans are annotated with these annotations. Here's an example. You can see at the bottom, we have a class called JPA Movie Finder, which implements an interface called Movie Finder. On that class, we've annotated it with @repository. This tells Spring that this class is a bean, that this class is a DAO. Similarly, on this class called simple movie lister, we have annotated it with @service. This tells Spring that this is a service layer bean. And this service layer has dependency on the data access layer. So you can see that it has a constructor which accepts the argument to be of type the interface of the data access layer. The simple movie lister constructor takes movie finder as an argument. On this constructor, we've applied @autowired. This @autowired annotation can be applied on constructors, setter methods, or even fields. In annotation-based configuration, this is how you do dependency injection, by making use of @autowired. Autowiring is by default byte type. What that means is Spring is going to look at the type of the argument. In this case, movie finder, which is an interface. So Spring is going to think, do I have a bean of type movie finder? And whichever bean implements that interface, it's going to take that bean and inject it by invoking this constructor with that bean as an argument. So it's going to do the dependency injection by invoking the constructor or setter, or by directly injecting it into the field. So this is how you can use annotation-based configuration. Let's now go to our project and try to do this annotation-based configuration. Right now, my project uses Java configuration. So the first step, what I'm going to do is I'm going to comment out all lines. So I've commented out all lines in this Java configuration class, which means now we don't have any explicit configuration at all. Instead, now I'm going to go to each of these individual beans and use the appropriate annotations to tell Spring that this is a bean. Firstly, to the DAO concrete class, the data access layer concrete class. So since it's a data access layer component, I'm going to annotate it with @repository. And since this class does not have dependence on any other bean, there is nothing to auto-wire into this bean. So we have just marked this bean as a repository. Next, I'm going to go to the service layer class and mark this as a bean. Since this is a service layer class, I'm going to annotate this with @service. So this @service tells Spring that this is a service layer class. This service layer bean in turn has dependency on the data access layer object, and that dependency needs to be injected by Spring by calling the setter method. So I'm going to annotate this setDAO method with @autowired. So this is how we do the dependency injection in annotation-based configuration using @autowired. Now I'll go to the UI layer bean. This UI layer bean is neither a data access object nor a service layer, nor is it actually a controller because this is not yet a web application. So I'm going to use the plain vanilla @component annotation to let Spring know that this is a bean, and it in turn has dependency on the service layer. To inject the dependency, we have a setter method, and on that setter method, I'm going to apply @autowired. So that's it. So now we have created our application to use annotation-based configuration. Let's verify it by running our main. Right-click, run as Spring Boot application. Everything seems to be coming up, prompting us for a name, test, an email. Yes, we're getting the customer ID, so therefore dependency injection is working. This is how we do annotation-based configuration. Now I can understand that you naturally gravitate towards annotation-based configuration over Java-based configuration that we saw earlier. But just keep in mind that you would still need Java-based configuration if you have to configure any library class as a bean. That is, only if you write the bean class, then you can annotate it with @repository, @service, @component, and such annotations. But if you have to use someone else's class, a class coming from a third-party library, as a bean, then you must still provide explicit configuration in the form of Java configuration. Not a problem because we can always mix and match both. So what is usually done in most projects is, for the beans that we write, we will use annotation-based configuration. For the beans that we need to configure from third-party libraries, we would use Java configuration.